Greetings and welcome everyone to this Impact Week panel on plastic pollution. We're so grateful to have you all here. My name is Daniel Melling. I'm student co-chair for the Impact Week conference at UCLA Anderson, and I'm a student in the fully employed MBA program. This event has been organized as part of our Impact Week, an annual conference that celebrates our community's commitment to creating a more equitable, just, and sustainable society. Impact Week is organized by UCLA Anderson's Impact at Anderson Center and the Net Impact MBA chapter in collaboration with partners within the business school and across the broader UCLA community. This event is presented in partnership with the UCLA Luskin Center for Innovation, which works to unite scholars with forward-looking civic leaders to solve environmental challenges. Before we begin, I want to offer a land acknowledgement. As a public and land-grant institution, it's important for UCLA to acknowledge that our campus resides on what was historically the homeland of Indigenous peoples who were dispossessed of their land. Impact at Anderson and our Net Impact chapter acknowledge our presence on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Gabrielino Tonga peoples. I will now hand it over to Charles Corbett, Professor of Operations Management and Sustainability and IBM Chair in Management at UCLA Anderson, to introduce our speakers. Thanks, everyone.
Wonderful. Thank you, Daniel, and thank you, everybody, all the participants and panelists. I think we've all been looking forward to this panel. So Impact Week has put together a fantastic program for the entire week. The Impact team has done a spectacular job under the leadership of Magali Delmas, the faculty director, and Bhavna Sivanand, the executive director, and the entire team at Impact Week. And then this particular panel is a joint effort also between Impact at Anderson and the UCLA Luskin Center for Innovation. I think so further proof that they've been able to put together an amazing panel is the fact that we have over 500 participants signed in to various different mechanisms to join us along here. And we have a panel with, I think, some fascinating, diverse range of perspectives on the issues. So we have federal and local government, academia, and business. So we're going to cover a huge amount of ground in the next 58 minutes. So the format that we'd like to follow is I will ask each of the panelists to take about 5 to 7 minutes to quickly share their perspectives, their thoughts, their insights on the issues. And then if there's any immediate clarification questions, we can take them right afterwards. But most of the larger questions and debate we'll keep till the end. You should have seen on the slide just now and in the chat, but will come again later, a link to a website called Slido. Many of you will know it, some of you may not. But the Slido website is the way that we'll be monitoring the questions. So if you have questions, please type it in Slido. We'll be looking at the questions, seeing which questions other people like. So if you see a question there that you say, hey, that's a great question, you don't have to retype it, you can upvote it. So that's always a good way to keep the audience actively involved in the discussion. So what I'd like to do then, without really further ado, is to start introducing the panelists. The first panelist, and Shane, let me check, is the congressman has been able to connect? I see, not yet. Still working on it. So maybe we should change the sequence just in the meantime. So let's make a quick mid-course adjustment in the sequence. So what I was one of our speakers, Daniel Coffey, is the researcher at the UCLA Luskin Center for Innovation, and Daniel graduated here from UCLA from the Luskin School of Public Affairs. He previously served as a volunteer in the Peace Corps, but currently he's working as a public policy researcher where he has spent a lot of time studying plastic waste. So we thought it would be a good way to kick off the panel by getting a bit of the academic research perspective on what some of the issues are. So Daniel, if you don't mind, let me hand it right over to you to sort of get us grounded on what exactly are we going to be talking about here.
Great, thank you, Dr. Corbett. Let me go ahead and share my screen. Can everyone see my slide? Is that working properly? Excellent. All right. Well, thanks again. Hopefully the congressman's able to join us soon because I'm excited to hear him speak. But what I'd like to do to start things off is kind of provide a bit of a more high-level overview of what some of the different challenges involved in the plastic waste issue are, and provide some context for how we got to this point. So to start with, I think it's important to underscore that plastic waste really is a multifaceted issue when it comes to the harms and impacts that it creates. Many of you are probably familiar with some of those ecological impacts. We've all seen the pictures of seabirds and marine mammals ingesting or entangled in marine debris of plastic nature. There's been many documented harms to wildlife, including to threatened and endangered species like sea turtles. And we've found plastic waste at this point in some form on every continent and pretty much in every biome on the planet. But there are other harms besides these that are important to highlight. One of them is climate. Right now, about 4% of global oil production goes towards the creation of plastic, but this is anticipated to reach as much as 20% by 2050, at least according to pre-COVID predictions. There's also been some fascinating research in the last 2 years from teams like University of Hawaii that have found that degradation of plastic in areas like the ocean can actually produce more potent greenhouse gases like methane and ethylene as it breaks down. We also have a big economic cost to plastic. It's estimated that about $350 billion a year is created in negative externalities across the globe from plastic, from health harms, ecological harms, and others. In California, one of the most acute ways this manifests is in local government costs, where we spend $300 or $400 million plus annually in waste cleanup. And we know from data that plastic items and debris are very heavily represented in litter and street garbage that we see. That is our taxpayer dollars that's going to clean that up. And lastly, there are some health impacts. Most of these have been identified in the production setting where manufacturers are exposed to carcinogens, but we also have the budding study of microplastics, and we don't yet really know what the long-term chronic health impacts of the constant ingestion of plastic through food and water are. It's estimated right now that the average person ingests about 5 grams of plastic per week, which is about the amount you find in a credit card. What that's doing to your health, especially to younger people, we don't yet know. So you might think that given that we have all these profound issues, how could we have let it get to this point? Did we just find out? Of course not. This problem has been known for quite a while. We know from some recent investigative reporting by Laura Sullivan at NPR that in 1973, an internal plastic industry report essentially admitted that plastic waste was not a feasible problem to tackle. They found that recycling plastic is nearly impossible, that it's expensive, that sorting it into its different types is infeasible, and that the degradation makes it less valuable from the recycling process. And this knowledge wasn't confined to the private industry. As early as 1990, the year I was born, to date myself, decades ago, an EPA report to Congress found that, this is a direct quote, most post-consumer plastic waste is landfilled, along with municipal solid waste. Only 1% of post-consumer plastic waste is recycled. This problem has been known for a long time. That's the key point that I'd like you to take away here. But it's been allowed to perpetuate and to fester, in part thanks to disinformation campaigns by those who profit off of its creation. So in the 1950s, we had the founding of Keep America Beautiful, with noted members like Dow Chemical and Coca-Cola, basically the people who make plastic products and the people who make the plastic that goes into those products. And they launched the iconic Crying Native American anti-littering campaign with the goal of shifting responsibility for litter onto consumers and avoiding any regulation of the production of those littered items. This was followed up in the 1970s by multi-million-dollar disinformation campaigns selling recycling to the American public, talking about how it was more or less the solution to any potential problems that could come out of the plastic-riddled economy. Often launched to much fanfare and then quietly shuttered when they couldn't make a profit. And the result of all this was that before 2018, 70% of US supposedly recycled plastic was being shipped overseas to China alone and more to other overseas markets. We were essentially saying out of sight, out of mind. But this could not last forever. And in 2018, the Chinese government enacted a policy called National Sword. What this did was it banned the imports to China of some plastic types, but more importantly, it limited the contamination of the plastic to 0.5%. That is a precipitous drop. Before this, contamination rates could be as high as 20% in some cases. And the result of this is that compared to the year before, in 2018, China, the US preeminent market for recovered plastic, their imports of plastic dropped by 99.1%. The market was essentially gone. And the ripple effects of this have also caused many other plastic importing nations like Indonesia to enact similar policies. And it's set a new standard for the global recycling market. And this is when we started seeing headlines like these, where without a market for the plastic that US consumers had been misled into believing was recyclable, many cities and companies just simply couldn't continue. We've had a number of high-profile bankruptcies in California. Replanet shuttered, the largest recycler in the state. And we're now grappling with how to tackle the fact that what we thought was recyclable simply is not. And I want to draw attention to one of the fundamental limitations of recycling here, because I think it's important to underscore that recycling is a harm reduction tool, but not a solution in and of itself. And the reason for that is that the recycling process, the way it works, is the grinding and heating that's involved in transforming a plastic product into recyclable plastic. It shortens the polymer fibers within the item, and that weakens it, it degrades it. And it means that a recycled plastic product, in terms of its tensile strength and its ability to do certain things, is of inferior quality. And that's why you usually see, in most cases, recycled items of recycled plastic, they're not typically 100% recycled, because that would create a weaker product that can't do the job. It depends on the continued production of new plastic from oil extracted from the ground, with all the environmental and climatological harms that that entails. And so I think it's important that we recognize that recycling is useful to mitigate damage, but we need to be engaging in more systemic solutions going forward. And that's where we get to our principles for the future. So before we even touch on recycling, we need to reduce our consumption of plastic, period. There are a number of strategies available to us to do this. One is substituting reusable items in packaging in a variety of contexts in place of single-use plastic. Recently, Starbucks, much to my excitement, announced that they were piloting a reusable cup and return program. As a coffee aficionado, that sounds great to me, and I'm really excited to see how that fares for them, and if that model can be exported to other food service sector areas. We also need to reduce extraneous single item usage. As I think Congressman Lowenthal will talk more about, one of the items in the Break Free from Plastic Pollution Act is the eliminating the use of things like disposable plastic utensils that more often than not are used once or maybe not at all and end up in the trash. We also can make design choices for products that involve using less material. Reducing the amount of plastic that's used in packaging will create better outcomes. And we can also substitute non-plastic alternatives, things like fiber-based and compostable materials and bioplastics in some situations. When it comes to recycling itself also, we need to create better outcomes. Among these, we need to eliminate the plastics and other items that are going into the waste stream that simply are not recyclable. There's only a few recycling codes, code 1, 2, and maybe 5 in California, that companies can actually get some money out of recycling. All the others should not be used to make single-use items. And we also need to eliminate mixed material items, things say like a paper cup with a plastic lining. Those things can't be separated by the recycler. They shouldn't be made. We also need to create better disposal outcomes by making it very easy for consumers through labeling and other schemes to know exactly what is and is not recyclable and where it should go. And lastly, we need to get item manufacturers, recycling operators, and companies like Noel Kinder's company, Nike, who's going to speak in a little bit, talking to each other about how to make it easy for plastic goods that are manufactured to get recycled, get recovered, and made into something new. And with that, I will turn it back to Dr. Corbett. Thank you very much.
Daniel, thank you very much. You've given us, I think, an amazingly sort of quick and comprehensive overview on the history and the reality of recycling and where we stand. You certainly also given me some food for thought, because you mentioned something like we eat one credit card of plastic worth per week. So now I'm certainly reconsidering what I have in my wallet. I probably should stop touching those. But thank you very much for that. So I'm sure we'll have questions later on as we hear some other perspectives. I'm delighted to introduce our next panelist, Congressman Alan Lowenthal, the U.S. representative of the California's 47th congressional district. And I know we're all really looking forward to hearing from the congressman. We're absolutely delighted that you could join. So Congressman Lowenthal is a fourth-term representative. Getting elected once, of course, is a huge achievement. Getting re-elected multiple times, even more so. So he got to this point initially from the City Council of Long Beach, and then as a California legislator. But his particular claim to fame is really a focus on common sense, bipartisan solutions. And I could spend the entire session just rattling off a long list of achievements, but I think one that really stands out, especially in the context of today's topic, is the achievements in greening the ports of Los Angeles and Long Beach in a way that also actually allowed the ports to still be commercially very successful, which I think is very much the theme of the panel that we have here today too. So without further ado, Congressman Lowenthal, thank you so much for joining us today, and let me turn the floor over to you.
Thank you. Can you hear me now?
You can hear you great.
All right. It was good to get on, and I'm a little rushed to Harry because I just came back from where the Long Beach Convention Center is opening up. This is a little different, but we're opening up the center for 1,000 to even more migrant children that have crossed the border. And I have to really compliment HHS and FEMA and the city of Long Beach for making it humane, child-oriented, tremendous care to these children and providing the resources and education. So it was a pleasure to be there. So now I'm moving from immigration issues to plastic pollution. I want to thank you, and I want to thank UCLA's Luskin School for inviting me to participate. It's a pleasure to join with the other panelists today. I've already, the previous panelists have mentioned some of the things and I'll kind of re-emphasize and redo. You know, we're here because the waste and the recycling system in this country is broken. There is no doubt about it. You know, as was pointed out, you know, really, you know, we, in our bins, we only recycle about 8% of material that says it's recyclable is only collected, and of that, less than 3%, and it was pointed out, is actually used in material. So it's an infinitesimally small amount. And as students of public policy and law, the issue should be of the utmost importance. The production and the pollution of plastics impacts our public health, it impacts the environment, and it's also part of the climate crisis that we need to address. You know, as the oil and gas industry seeks to further make up for their lost revenues in energy and in transportation, which they will, they turn to petrochemicals and plastics as a way to enhance their revenues. Don't blame them, but that's their, you know, it's our responsibility to look at that and see what the impacts are on our environment and on our health. And the issue is only going to get worse unless we act now to build a more sustainable economy. It's not simply this plastic pollution or waste crisis, a solid waste issue. It's a climate change issue. It's an environmental justice issue, and it's an international human rights issue where you know, well, I've been concerned and aware of this problem for decades now, and I became aware when I was on the Long Beach City Council, and one of my neighbors was a man, and I credit him with my early involvement, was a man called Captain Charles Moore. Captain Moore is the founder and the executive director of Algalita, which is based here in Long Beach. And Captain Moore is credited for the discovery and the early research into the Pacific garbage gyre or the garbage patch. He came back and showed me pictures of what they had seen, and so that we're not just talking about landfill, we're not just talking about shipping it overseas, we're also talking about a humongous patch of of plastic that's in the Pacific. And it's in other places also, but he showed me and went back and documented over a number of years. So it influenced my efforts when I was then elected to the California State Legislature to continue working on these issues, banning styrofoam packaging, limiting plastic bag pollution. Some of the legislation worked, some of it I was not able to convince my colleagues yet of it. My desire to address this issue only grew when I came to Congress, and I began to see the connection with climate crisis and how the production and the waste impacts, both the production and the waste impacts, began to have a differential impact on some communities, frontline and fence line communities. It became clearer and clearer to me that not all of us see the impacts as much and suffer from those impacts. And then about a little over 2.5 years ago, I had to decide, my wife and I, what were we going to do for my son's birthday? And he had always wanted to go to Antarctica. And so we joined a National Geographic Explorer tour with scientists, photographers, deep sea divers going, and a few passengers, about 50 to 100 passengers on this Explorer tour. And there, as we were there, the scientists opened up fish and birds that had died in Antarctica, and I was shocked. Because what they wanted to demonstrate to me and to other passengers was the immense amount of plastic that these animals had digested in the Antarctica, the most remote place on this planet. It was overwhelming to see the amount that now has stretched to the most remote parts of this planet. I came back more determined than ever to do something about this issue, to talk to other members of Congress. We spent a year long after coming back in the end of 2018 and fall of 2019, taking public comments, working with other groups that were interested in it, academics. And I was immensely proud working with my colleague in the Senate, Senator Udall at the time, as the key, to introduce in early 2020, about in February of 2020, just before the pandemic, we introduced the Break Free from Plastic Pollution Act. It didn't pass. It actually never even got a markup in the last Congress, but it represented a dramatic shift in the conversation in Congress. People began to understand this. And I was proud to reintroduce the bill, working with Senator Merkley, who has become the lead author in the Senate, the lead sponsor in the Senate. Now that Senator Udall has retired, we reintroduced it. And it's Senator Merkley who goes every place and talks about the ingestion of a credit card's worth of plastics, I think, routinely, regularly, every week. And a little bit about the bill. The bill is in Congress and has got everybody's attention because it's a comprehensive approach. That's really what we're doing. It's to deal with the plastic waste problem, but it doesn't just deal with the issue at the back end, how to clean it up and what to do the way, or what resources we can do about recycling. But it really introduces some new concepts in the Congress anyway, certainly not in every state, which we're seeing, and certainly that we've already seen in the EU and other places. But so the bill is not new or radical. It's only new and potentially radical in the Congress, not anywhere else, because the Congress has never, has been behind what, local communities are doing in many ways. The legislation ensures that communities are protected from the health and environmental impacts of plastic production and plastic pollution and the impacts of plastic pollution and waste, because we say, municipalities, you are no longer burdened with the responsibility of cleaning this up. That has been the model in this country. It's been up to the municipality by requiring what is called extended producer responsibility, or that producers are responsible for the end use of their own products, by incorporating minimum recycled content and standards, by prohibiting the development of certain kinds of plastic products and phasing them out over time, some that you mentioned, by investing, by saying that the producers of the plastics have to design, fund, and develop a system to collect all of this. We create a structure and incentive to build better products and close the loophole for a circular economy, which is we've deemed. And as we've seen, as I've already alluded to and mentioned, that as we've seen in the COVID-19 pandemic, the most vulnerable populations in our country are the ones that are disproportionately impacted. These tend to be communities of color, immigrant communities who live in urban areas nearest the incinerators, nearest the facilities, to the production facilities. And that's the same for climate change. And so we're beginning to see some of the similarities between both crises. So when we reintroduce the bill, we enhance the environmental justice part and the policies in Break Free from Plastic Pollution Act by having a comprehensive study now by EPA and the National Academies of Science on the cumulative impacts on human health. We've seen, that was just seen before when the last speaker said, well, we know what is happening, we just don't know what those health impacts are. Well, that's exactly right. We don't know, and we're going to measure some of those health impacts, and that's now part of the study. And we're going to require that we look at these and ask EPA to look at the environmental impacts from incinerators, from plastic production facilities and refineries, and require EPA to update our clean air and clean water regulations on the basis of what they have found in these studies, what those impacts. So we have more of an empirical and scientific background, so that we can understand and regulate these facilities and ensure that they don't poison the environment or the populations that live near these facilities. The bill is going to ban commonly polluting plastic items like plastic bags, styrofoam and packaging, foodware, and replace them with more sustainable. As was pointed out, we need to use more sustainable alternatives. It's going to encourage reuse. It's going to standardize recycling. It's going to standardize labeling across the country, and it's going to seek to address issues on tobacco waste. Since introducing this legislation last year, many of these policies, including extended producer responsibility, minimum recycled content standards, environmental justice protection, have been introduced in dozens of state legislatures throughout the nation, including now this year in California legislature. No longer will the industry be able to put the burden on municipalities and taxpayers. No longer will the plastic and petrochemical industries be allowed to pollute our environment and our communities. And that's kind of where we are right now in the Congress. The bill has been introduced in both the Senate, and the House. They've set the first hearings in the Senate on the bill. In the House, the bill has been included in the Select Committee on Climate Change that was set up by Speaker Pelosi, and this bill was identified as one of the key bills in that. And this year, the Energy and Commerce Committee has taken parts of the bill and put that in their climate change bill, some of the major parts about extended. And again, showing that link between climate crisis and plastic pollution crisis. So that's kind of where we are at this moment.
Wonderful, Congressman Lowenthal. Thank you so much for giving that update. And of course, thank you also for all your efforts at so many different levels to address this huge problem. You also gave us, I think, a very healthy reminder that, I mean, for many of us who live in Los Angeles, I guess we kind of get used to seeing trash around the street here and there. And even though we don't like it, we get used to it. But you gave us a healthy reminder that we certainly should not ever get used to finding trash in birds in Antarctica. This is just not right.
That's right.
So thanks for that reminder. So, and Congressman Lowenthal, I gather you might have to leave a little early. So we wanted to get the questions from the audience to you before the end. And in fact, it turns out you answered, or almost completely answered, the number one question that the audience had, which was, so they're asking, you introduced the Break Free from Plastic Pollution Act, and do you have any updates or hope for the legislation being enacted? So you gave us, I think, most of the update already, but if I could just ask.
Yes, I think I'll just repeat, and maybe most likely, my guess is, given the nature and the difficulty and the power of the oil and gas industry and the plastic production, that the bill, many of parts of the bill will probably be able to get through, even with some bipartisan. And I think it's going to be difficult for the entire bill to get through this year. It will be given the nature of the Congress, because there are a number of other bills also that the Congress has identified that from the House of Representatives that are going to be difficult to get through also. But it's going to be talked about more, and as I said, the other part that we've done is maybe because of the COVID-19 crisis, we have become more and more aware of the environmental justice issues that surround plastics. Also, where those refineries are, where those incinerators, and we put a prohibition on any new incinerators until EPA does that study, any new plastic production facilities, that is going to cause some concern by the plastics industry. But we need to get our handle on it and to really understand just more what the impact is. And we need to make sure that if the plastics that we will be using, that we increase the amount of recycled material in them when it's possible, or find alternatives. And we also have a bottle bill in there, a container beverage bill. We've got to incentivize recycling. So I think where many of those parts may get pulled out of the bill and used in others, I think the most difficult part passing will be the extended producer responsibility part, that saying that you created this, you built this, you've got to fix this problem.
Thank you very much for that. And in fact, you've also already touched on a number of issues that I'm sure our other two panelists will also be addressing about extended producer responsibility and other local responsibilities. So I'd love to introduce our next panelist then as well, Noel Kinder from Nike. So Noel is the Chief Sustainability Officer at Nike. He's been at Nike since 1999. He's had a pretty wide range of roles of Nike, so I think he can represent many different aspects of the company, including being the general manager of Nike Vietnam for some period of time. And earlier when I introduced Daniel, I mentioned that Daniel had served in the Peace Corps. The same is true for Noel as well. So Noel, thank you very much again also for joining us, and let me give the floor to you.
Thanks, Charles. I picked up on your intro from Daniel as well, and we were chatting offline about our Peace Corps experiences. So there must be a common denominator for those that work in sustainability to start their journey in the Peace Corps. And I cannot get over the credit card comment. I think that that's something I will be sharing with everybody I know as soon as I possibly can. Actually, the Peace Corps is kind of my entry point into this conversation, because I can remember really distinctly, I was in Honduras in the late 90s. Having a conversation with my landlord, who was also my best friend at the time. She had a toddler who was still in diapers, and periodically in that part of the world, you get massive rainstorms. And as you can imagine, the roads aren't paved, they're gravel. And the rain would literally turn the road in front of our house into just a stream, a river, depending on the rainflow. And I watched her at one point change her son's diaper and throw it out the window into the raging river. And I said, mortified, being from Portland, Oregon, and the son of old hippies, asked her what was she doing, and she said, well, we don't really have garbage service here, so it just goes away. Well, in a lot of ways, that's still what we're doing. And I think Dan's presentation was a good example of the fact that even in the developed world, if that's still a term we use, you put your plastics in a recycling bin and they go off somewhere ultimately probably that isn't the most optimal. And so that experience for me obviously was really impactful to me. It really helped shape who I am and part of the reason why I do what I do. A couple of years ago at Nike, we launched what we call our Move to Zero initiative. And that is the aspiration to have a net zero carbon footprint and zero waste. And for a company the size and scale of Nike, and given what we make, that's more than a little ambitious. And so we have a tendency as a culture within the company to like these big rallying cries. Some of you may be familiar with Breaking 2, which was the ambition to find a way to break the 2-hour marathon barrier. And so that Move to Zero has really kind of become the anchor point for what we do. But you have to be a little more tactical if you're actually going to make the steps toward change. And so just a few weeks ago, we launched our impact report, which is kind of our own public report card on how we've done on the things we've committed to do. And we sunset our 2020 targets and launched our 2025 targets. And those are 13 different targets across a range of areas. But for the purposes of this conversation, one of those areas is waste, more specifically reducing waste. And so that's everything from reducing packaging waste to the plastic dunnage, those little air pillows you get when you order something, eliminating those from our products in the shipping process, and continuing to take more and more product back from our consumers, the reference to extended producer responsibility, which is interesting for us because it's actually a program we've had in place for 25 years, believe it or not, a program called Reuse a Shoe to actually bring product back. And so that aspiration is super important, but the tactical steps to actually achieve it are even more important. And it includes things like eliminating plastic bags from our retail footprint, right? It used to be that when you walked into a Nike store, you bought something and you'd get an orange plastic bag with a big white swoosh on it. Well, obviously, to Daniel's point, that's not a fantastic idea for the planet. And frankly, the people that buy our products, particularly the core consumer cohort, really care about these things. And so not only do we do it because it's the right thing to do, but we do it because we know that the consumers that buy our products are really, really passionate about this. But even more importantly, beyond those tactical steps is really about the product that we make. And so things like somebody referenced in the chat, and we can get to this when we get to the questions, but products like Space Hippie. So if you're not familiar with Space Hippie, it was a little bit of a science experiment for us where the innovation and design team said, hey, what's the lowest carbon footprint shoe that we can possibly make? And the answer was use as much waste as you can possibly use as the feedstock into that product. And so we learned a lot. It's not perfect. There's a lot more to learn from that. But I think it gives us the opportunity to really start to think in terms of circularity in a way that we haven't before. And so I'm really honored to be part of this discussion. I've learned a ton just in the last 28 minutes. And so I'm looking forward to learning a lot more over the course of the discussion.
Great, wonderful, and you indeed noticed already that one of the questions that came up in the chat was about the Space Hippie. So we'll probably come back to that in a little bit. But thank you very much for that. And then let me introduce our next panelist, Rita Kampalath, who is the Sustainability Program Director at the LA County Chief Sustainability Office. She joined that office in 2017, is currently involved in implementing the county's first sustainability plan. Previously worked also, though, as the Science and Policy Director at Heal the Bay, which, of course, is another organization that's been acutely aware of many of the issues that we're discussing here from perhaps a different sort of physical perspective in a way than the county, but very much the same set of issues. And Rita earned her PhD here in civil and environmental engineering from UCLA prior to that. So Rita, thank you very much also for joining us today, and let me hand the virtual floor over to you.
Great. Well, thanks. Yeah, UCLA alum, so always great to be at UCLA at some of these events. And it's hard to follow all these speakers. I feel like all the great points have already been said, but it's so great to hear what's happening in all these different sectors, private sector, academia, and then of course, just the great leadership on the federal level through Senator Lowenthal. So really appreciate that. So good afternoon, everyone. Once again, my name is Rita Kampalath. I'm with the LA County Chief Sustainability Office. For those of you not familiar with the office, we're a small, relatively new team to the county, just been around for about 5 years old now. And our main charge, again, was to create the county's first sustainability plan, which was, happy to say, it was adopted in 2019. So probably unsurprisingly, waste and resource management, and especially plastics management, is a priority in the sustainability plan. And this has already been discussed today by all the great speakers, so I won't go into it too much, but there's so many sustainability related facets to plastics management. You know, we've heard so much about ocean health and water quality. As Dan so carefully laid out, the plastics crisis has really brought public awareness to our issues with recycling and waste management generally, and that need to start thinking about a circular economy. I think as Senator Lowenthal also mentioned, we also see plastics management as an equity issue, where many of our disadvantaged communities have to bear the burden of waste management facilities, truck trips, and also, of course, fossil fuel extraction. LA County, not everybody knows this, but has been called the largest urban oil field in the country, which is problematic in itself with such a developed area. But surveys have also found that residents living closest to new and active oil wells are disproportionately people of color, lower income, and ranked in the top 25% of the CalEnviro Screen census tracts, which, if you're not familiar with that tool, is something created by the state, which helps identify disadvantaged communities who face environmental burdens particularly. And again, this has been stated before, but we know that oil companies are shifting investments towards production of plastics as fossil fuel use is projected to decrease. So if we want to address issues around extraction and climate change, we have to rethink our relationship with plastics and disposables in particular. I'm not anti-plastic across the board. Plastics were a great innovation. They have clear and important applications. My uncle recently had to get a pacemaker. We know that satellite parts, the Ingenuity helicopter has plastic parts. And I think we're all grateful for their longevity and durability in those uses. But there is a fundamental disconnect when you talk about single-use plastics, in that you have a material that is designed to last for thousands of years, being used for products that are only needed for like a day, hours, maybe minutes in some cases. So again, all those are reasons why addressing this issue is really a priority for the sustainability plan. Specifically, our plan calls for an equitable strategy to phase out single-use plastics. Very ambitious, high level. As I said, it was just adopted in 2019, so we're still kind of starting up a lot of our action around that. Of course, we were also contending with the pandemic during that time. But we've taken a few steps so far to move forward. One, kind of our most recent action is an accessories upon request ordinance, which should be introduced to the Board of Supervisors in the next few weeks. Last year, and we also had been focused on a pretty comprehensive food serviceware ordinance, and Dan didn't mention this, but that ordinance development was supported by some great work that Dan and colleagues did at the Luskin Center. Unfortunately, again, that was put on hold because of the pandemic and particularly its impact on restaurants, but we are hoping to bring it back. A key strategy, though, too, for us is in accomplishing a lot of our goals on a local level is to support and advocate for work that's happening at the state level. Because, we do see a lot of these challenges as, best dealt with at that higher level. So I'll just take a moment here to highlight a few of those that we're particularly interested in and following, and which really kind of go to the heart of a lot of the issues that have been driving our work. There are 3 efforts on the state level kind of aimed at broadly addressing single-use products. Similar, maybe not as ambitious as Senator Lowenthal's bill, but on the state level at least. One of them is SB 54, led by Senator Allen, AB 842, and then also a potential ballot initiative that's sponsored by Recology, which is a waste management firm. And those would really look at targeting items that aren't recyclable or compostable. And the Recology ballot actually would also impose a tax on plastics that would be used to support recycling infrastructure and environmental restoration. So keep an eye out for that, because that's something that everybody will be voting on if it goes through in 2022. Aside from those more overarching bills, there are a number that are intended to kind of address very specific issues. One of those, there are a few that are aimed at labeling, which I know is something that's also been brought up. There's AB 818, 1201, and then SB 343, all aimed at tackling that very frustrating problem that consumers have to deal with of labeling not really being indicative of how products are used. So ensuring that there are standards associated with whether something is labeled as recyclable or compostable. In one of the cases, flushable in the terms of disposable wipes, whether it's, something that's going to cause problems in our wastewater system. There's also a statewide work on accessories upon request, AB 1276, that would also prohibit full service restaurants from using disposable utensils. And then AB 1371, which addresses packing materials for packages, and also institute a take back program for packaging materials and plastics. So with that, before I turn it over, I just want to close off by saying, it's important to remember that single-use plastics didn't really become popular until the 60s. And it wasn't until the 70s that plastic bags were a thing. So they're a huge challenge to deal with, but we did function with them. There were restaurants and takeout before single-use plastics. There were grocery stores before single-use plastic bags. And there were even cars in drive-through before there was plastics food serviceware. So while it will be a challenge, it's good to see all these sectors coming together to tackle this problem, because it'll take innovation, but I think it is something we can deal with.
Hey, Rita, thank you very much for that. And thanks especially also for that sort of uplifting, positive note at the end, saying, we may have created a big problem quickly, but maybe that also means we can solve a big problem quickly as well. So the audience has been sending lots and lots of questions, and I'd love to start posing some of these questions to you. And I want to start with a question that applies to everybody, but I particularly want to make sure that I give Congressman Lowenthal the chance to respond first, just in case he has to leave early. So this is a question I know is on the mind of many, many people watching today. And that is, now, in efforts to reduce plastic pollution, where should individuals focus their efforts? Right? We've heard a bit about institutions, companies, and so on, but for each of us listening here as individuals, do our choices actually make a difference in light of the huge use of plastics in manufacturing and shipping and elsewhere? So what can we as individuals do? And Congressman Lowenthal, what would you say?
Well, we can. There are some things that was just pointed out. For example, we have to be clearer in our use. We should not be flushing certain wet wipes down the toilet. That is up to the responsibility of individuals. Now, we should be labeling those better, and we're trying to do that in the bill. They should be discussing this. I think one of the things that is, just as we've learned about the equity issue, I think that is becoming more, that we're all in this together, only some people are having to pay the impacts of plastic pollution even more than others, and we should be talking about that. We should be using recyclable bags. We should be using things when we go to the store. We should find alternatives ourselves. It's the responsibility, I think, of people to find those alternatives. And they should support, I get a lot of letters and emails about a lot of things. They should support legislation that really tries to tackle and reduce the problem.
Thank you. So you're pointing to our responsibility both as consumers and as citizens in this issue. Let me actually go through the panel in reverse order of what we did earlier. So Rita, what would you say individuals can and should do?
Yeah, I think there are a lot of things that individuals can do. A lot of this change is going to come through changes in behavior and consumer use. That really drives. There's a lot of purchasing power on the consumer level, right? And as we've seen new practices become really standard, like in California, bringing reusable carryout bags and things like that, those things become a part of our culture and they become more accepted. There becomes more, more support for them. So I think kind of leading the way is really important. These ultimately, especially when we're talking about single-use plastics, so many of them are consumer products. So if consumers start changing their choices, I think that will drive things. I will say, though, that on the flip side of that, we need to make it easier for people to make good choices. And that's our challenge as policymakers and leaders in industry and so on. It is really hard right now to always make a good choice. People can't control packaging and things like that. So it's going to take solutions on multiple levels.
Thank you. And that almost sounds like a perfect segue to hear Noel's perspective on this.
Well, I don't know that I can say it much better than Rita said it. I think, there's this balance between personal choice and personal behavior and making it easier for people to make the right choice. I think that's a really good way to say it. I mean, me personally, I've gone through this exercise mentally for a couple of years, certainly as long as I've been in this role. And, I think it's making the small changes that you can just make. I mean, for me, the first thing I did when I kind of launched myself into this world was stop using single-use coffee cups. I mean, Dan's point about the fact that it's mixed material as well, it drives me crazy, right? You really have to focus on what are those little incremental things that you can do. And as a parent of 3 teenagers, that sets an example for them as well, right? So we have a whole horde of reusable coffee cups in our house now that everybody uses. But I agree with Rita's point as well. I mean, we those of us that have influence in areas like this have an obligation to make it easier for people to make those decisions. And so, for us as a company, and for me sitting in the role that I sit in, things like eliminating single-use plastic bags out of our retail footprint is a really important step, because people can't choose. They can choose not to get a bag, but most people buy enough stuff that they're going to want to carry it with them. And so giving them an alternative that's a choice that they don't have to make, I think is a really important aspect as well.
Great, thank you. And then, so Daniel, you started out by giving us sort of the big picture perspective on what's realistic and what isn't. But what would you have to say about what impact do individual choices actually have in all this?
Yeah, well, I second all the great points that have just been made, but one that hasn't yet, and one that I think maybe has the greatest potential, is if we're going to tackle these widespread systemic problems, it needs to have a systemic solution. And that means one enacted by our elected representatives. So voting for individuals at the local, state, and federal levels who know this is a priority, people like Congressman Lowenthal, and communicating with the offices of your elected representatives that this is an important issue to you, that individual political action, I think, can be influential.
Great. Well, so thank you very much. So here's a different question, which has come up briefly, indirectly, but the audience clearly wants to go a little bit deeper into this. So this is... So the question is, what would happen? Let's see. Something happened to the sequence of questions. So the question was, what would, given that oil and gas is still being explored, is still there, and if we're successful at drastically reducing the use of plastics, what happens with that, say, with that excess raw material, as the audience member is putting it? Is this? Are we just going to basically shift the problem somewhere else, and we don't really quite know where yet? What's going to happen if, with all that material that is still somehow being extracted from the planet? And then again, I'd like to ask Congressman Lowenthal maybe to give a first thought on that.
Well, I think that we are seeing now that the nation and the world is going through a transition of moving from the extraction of oil and gas to a renewable society, using for energy, using for packaging, using for power. We are moving towards sustainable, renewable energies. It's going to take us some time to do that. Ultimately, we will reduce the need for this. Part of that will be federal discussion, on that. Part of it will be companies themselves, as we pointed out, relying less on that. And I think we're already beginning. I think what we're seeing is the model. We still have tremendous amounts of coal in this country, but we are that model of weaning ourselves and moving towards alternatives is happening. I think the real critical issue is not so much can we do this, is how do we make sure that we protect those communities that relied on the extraction and provide them with alternatives that are sustainable, clean, and they can maintain their way of life and have jobs. And I think that's what's in the president's job plan. It doesn't answer everything, but it really tries to attack that issue because it's a critical issue. We do not want another Rust Belt in the United States.
Okay, thank you very much. Let's see, Rita. Rita and Noel or Daniel, any additional thoughts on in addition to what Congressman Lowenthal just mentioned?
I think Congressman Lowenthal really summarized it great, and those were excellent points. So I would just echo those. I just uplift something that he said about renewables. I mean, I think the key to this is that we're seeing that the companies themselves are sort of seeing the writing on the wall, and we're seeing oil and gas companies shift to renewables. So I don't think those companies are going to follow where the profit is, and if they see less demand, they're going to start creating less product and shift their business model. So I think that's kind of what we're seeing. Yeah.
So it sounds like what both of you were saying in a way is that the assumption in the question is not correct, that it's not there's not going to be a lot of excess raw material left over if we don't use it for plastic. In fact, this is part of moving away from fossil fuels in every possible use case of fossil fuels. So that's a very encouraging way to look at that.
If I may, Dr. Corbett, there's actually an example from recent history that kind of illustrates this point that the questioner presented. From the COVID pandemic, the drop in demand for fossil fuels for transportation created a drop in price, and we actually did see an uptick in plastic production because the source material was now cheaper. And so I think it's important to emphasize the point that Rita and Congressman Lowenthal have both made, which is that we can't approach the reduction in demand for plastic in a vacuum. It has to be accompanied by a more comprehensive strategy, or else we will just end up shifting that oil to a different end market.
Great. Thank you very much. And I think we probably have time for one more quick question. There's 3 minutes left before we reach the hour. So what a lot of people in the audience would love to know is, as this develops further and after a panel like this and many other events like this that you all participate in, how will each of you interact differently across the policy, private sector, academia, as we go forward with these discussions? So, Noel, we didn't ask you just now. Any thoughts on different forms of interaction going forward?
Well, I think all of this has underscored just the further need for collaboration. I mean, one of the things that's been readily apparent to me in the role that I'm in just in the last couple of years is that the problems that we're talking about, whether it's climate change or plastic pollution, are sufficiently complex that they require, at least in the private sector, a brand to extend beyond its own scope, right? So that includes organizations like the Sustainable Apparel Coalition in our case, or collaboration, frankly, even with direct competitors or industries beyond ours. And so while I wouldn't say it's different, I think it just underscores the importance of that for big, large multinationals like ourselves to continue to work with policymakers, with academia. I've already pinged Dan to see if you're willing to talk to me offline because we have to continue to educate ourselves, right? We're good at certain things, but we're not academics. And so I think continuing to seek input and guidance from those that are experts in this area will be super important as well.
Well, thank you. And Congressman Lowenthal, what are your thoughts on the forms of interaction going forward?
Well, I agree with that in terms of collaboration. I just remember when you had mentioned at the beginning of the show how one of the things I work with, it certainly wasn't me, it was a large people, including Heal the Bay. When I first started, neighbors kept coming up to me, and I was on the city council, and people said, "What is this black soot in the window?" And it was diesel particulates from the ports, because I live right near there. And when I first began to address that issue with them, they said, well, we can't have economic development and environmental protection. We will mitigate some of that later on, but our major goal is economic development. And they changed it after a lot of community input and legislative work. They changed their business model to say, no, we'll only have economic development with environmental protection at the same time, and that we will make more money doing this. We will embed that this will not limit our, is what they thought. They realized this would enhance their development. And I think that came from lots and lots of people collaborating and talking and not seeing the ports as the enemy, but part of the solution. And I think that's what's going to have to happen.
Fantastic, thank you. It looks like we have reached 1 o'clock, so let me just see, Rita, do you have any additional thoughts on the interaction question before we close?
I don't have much to add. We love collaboration here, especially on the local level. As I said, we work with UCLA quite frequently, and totally understand that forwarding these policies are going to take everybody working together.
Yeah. And of course, I did pick questions that were the most popular, but as an academic, of course, I was biased towards that particular one because I know academia benefits tremendously from the opportunity to interact with all of you. I mean, in industry, in policy making, and regulators. So that's how we can help you and how you can help us. And I think this panel was just a great example of precisely that. It is 1 o'clock. There's dozens more questions that I would love to pose to you, but unfortunately, we don't have time for that. But I think that just shows how much food for thought you've given to the audience here, both in terms of some big questions, but also in terms of what they can do as individuals, as consumers, and as citizens. So I'd like to bring the proceedings to a close here. I'd just like to thank you all very much again. So Daniel, Rita, Noel, and Congressman Lowenthal, thank you so much again for participating in this event, for sharing your insights, and for everything that you do on this incredibly important topic. So with that, I will close the formal part of the proceedings here. And I wish all the participants an enjoyable rest of Impact Week, and thank you for joining us here today. So take care.